The song Amazing Grace is still one of the most performed and recorded songs of all time. It's performed, not just sung by randoms like you and me. Okay, I'm the random, you're not. It's performed, not just sung, 10 million times every year. It's recorded almost 7,000 times up until now in a studio setting, recorded and released. And it's been sung for well over 250 years now. The song Amazing Grace. It's got to be the most popular song of all time. People will say, oh, such and such a song has been sung and recorded more in the last 50 years. But you got to remember, Amazing Grace has been around for about 250 years, and it's such a powerful song. It's such it captures people's hearts. Why? Because it's talking about the grace of God. Now, the Bible says that in chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 6 to 8, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. And I talked about this in a previous podcast, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I'll destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I've made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah lived in a really bad generation. He lived in a generation that had turned its back on God. It was the most sophisticated generation the world had ever seen. It had the latest gadgets, the latest technology. People had probably found ways to farm more effectively and efficiently. They had more leisure time. They were chilling. But the Bible says they gave themselves to violence. They gave themselves to sexual immorality. The world was a dark place, and there was no justice in the earth. People were cruel to each other. They weren't kind to each other. But in the midst of that, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Do you know the story of Amazing Grace? Do you know who wrote the song? And maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you can never hear the story enough. His name was John Newton. And way back in the 18th century in the British Empire, he was a slave trader. He made money out of human misery. These slave traders, and they weren't just British, there was Europeans, Arabs used to do it as well. They'd go down to Africa and they would snatch African men, women, sometimes children, who were, to be fair, captured by other Africans and taken to the coast and sold. And these Europeans and Arabs would put them on these boats and shackle them together and send them into the West Indies and send them into parts of the Middle East, send them into North and South America, and many of them would die. There was sickness on the boats, and if any of the slaves, got sick, they were thrown overboard, and it was just horrible. Separated from their families and sent to a new land where they were slaves, where they didn't have political freedom and personal freedom. They didn't have financial freedom. It was awful. It's an awful part of human history, and sadly, it wasn't the first time. There's been slavery since the day dot. The ancient Greek Empire, there was a lot of slavery. The Romans used slaves. The Ottoman Empire used slaves. I mean, so many empires and people groups throughout history have used slaves. It's nothing new, but this is the one that is probably the one that we're all very aware of in recent history. And John Newton was one of the grubs that sold humanity, that traded in humanity. He was a grub. He was not a nice person. And he made money out of human misery, out of death and separation of families and people dying of sickness and people having to be slaves to other people. And he was a grub. But somehow he found grace. He heard about Jesus. He realized that Jesus had died for him. He realized his sins could be forgiven. And he responded. He gave his heart to the Lord. He stopped selling slaves. He stopped trading in slaves. He actually became a minister of the church in England, and he started to serve God. And one day in about 1773, I think it was, for a New Year's Eve service, he wrote the song Amazing Grace. Why is the song so powerful? Because that's a man who had experienced the grace of God. That was a man who was not a good man. He was not a good person. He was in a very dark place. He was a horrible human being. And the grace of God came to his life, and he found salvation, and he couldn't understand how he could be saved. That's why the words of the song says that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Man, it's a powerful song. You know what? I don't know what you've done. I don't know where you've been. I don't know who you've been with, but I know this. God's grace can come to your life. His grace can save you. Or maybe you know people that aren't saved and you think, man, they're so lost, they're so dark. God can save them as well. The grace of God can come to anyone. It came to John Newton and it came to Noah, and it can come to you and the people in your world.